In the centuries leading up to the direct clash between Rome and Carthage, the Mediterranean Sea was not merely a backdrop for trade and maritime routes. It was a field of ever-shifting power where entire civilizations vied for influence, resources, and dominance. On the western edge of the Mediterranean, a power emerged that, though still young compared to the millennia-old empires of the East, advanced with unprecedented discipline and veracity: Rome. To the south, however, flourished a civilization that had inherited the mercantile cunning of the Phoenicians, transforming into the richest and most cosmopolitan of the African cities, Carthage. Two powers forged by distinct histories and opposing ideals, yet destined for an inevitable collision. By the 3rd century before Christ, Rome was no longer merely a fortified city in Latium. It had become an expansionist republic with a highly functional political system based on elective magistracies, a dominant senate, and a military class trained for absolute obedience. Its power was grounded not only in weapons, but also in its capacity to integrate conquered peoples, offering alliances in exchange for loyalty and soldiers. The Roman army, made up of organized legions and led by ambitious consuls, had become the engine by which the city advanced toward dominance over the Italian peninsula. And Rome, like a voracious organism, did not stop. Every victory was the prelude to the next war, every treaty an opening for new ambitions. In the Roman mindset, peace was merely the strategic pause between two conflicts. Across the sea, Carthage shone like the jewel of North Africa. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre around the 9th century before Christ, the city thrived thanks to its strategic location and the maritime legacy of its founders. It dominated trade routes between East and West, sourcing metals from Iberia, grains from North Africa, oriental spices and manufactured goods. Its strength lay not on land but at sea. A powerful navy composed of hundreds of swift triremes ensured naval monopoly over the western Mediterranean. Carthage also possessed a commercial empire spread across islands, ports, and coastal outposts, a discreet but effective dominion sustained more by wealth and diplomacy than by military conquest. Its elites, organized into councils and tribunals, governed with pragmatism and a focus on profits. While Rome marched with soldiers, Carthage negotiated with coins. Yet these rising powers, despite their distance in culture and method, were connected by one inescapable factor: Sicily. This triangular island at the heart of the Mediterranean was simultaneously an agricultural granary, a naval outpost, and a geopolitical crossroads. Controlling Sicily meant controlling the routes between Africa, Italy, and Greece. For centuries, the island had been the stage of conflict between Greeks and Carthaginians, but Rome's growing influence on the Italian peninsula was beginning to alarm Carthaginian counselors, and with reason. Rome had defeated the Samnites, the Etruscans, and the cities of Magna Graecia. Its relentless expansion did not honor treaties. It imposed its presence with coercive diplomacy, asymmetric agreements, and veiled threats. The Carthaginian elite, though pragmatic, began to realize that Rome would not forever respect the established zones of influence. However, the rivalry was not just geopolitical, it was ideological. Rome viewed Carthage as a decadent power, ruled by commercial interests, impure in its values, and dangerously rich. Carthage, in turn, despised Roman militarism and its obsession with honor and glory, seeing them as organized barbarians. The Romans revered virtues: the warrior's virtue, the honor of combat, and dying for the fatherland. The Carthaginians valued profit, stability, and the continuity of trade. It was a tension between two distinct civilizational models, one rooted in conquest and civic duty, the other shaped by diplomacy, wealth, and commerce. And between them, a growing resentment fueled by dubious alliances, regional betrayals, and indirect struggles for influence. As the 3rd century before Christ progressed, the maps of the era depicted a Rome hemmed in only by geography, no longer by powerful enemies. To the south, Carthage seemed secure in its maritime hegemony, but weakened by an excessive reliance on mercenaries instead of a national army. It was within this tense and unstable scenario that the first direct confrontation began to take shape, not by formal declaration of war, but by the request for aid from a minor ally, a city dispute between Messana and Syracuse. Yet in practice, that first step would mark the beginning of one of the longest and most devastating rivalries in human history. When Rome crossed the strait into Sicily, Carthaginian advisors understood that war was inevitable. What they perhaps did not know was that they were ushering in a trilogy of wars that would last more than a century, redefine the balance of power in the ancient world, and transform Rome from a peninsular power into a Mediterranean empire. And Carthage, from queen of the seas into ashes under the weight of Roman salt. Before becoming Rome's greatest rival, Carthage had, for centuries, been the legitimate heir to one of the most enigmatic and resilient civilizations of the ancient East, the Phoenicians. The city of Tyre, located on the coast of what is now Lebanon, was once one of the greatest commercial centers of antiquity. From there, daring sailors set out, braving the uncertainties of the sea to found colonies all along the Mediterranean coast. And among all the Phoenician colonies, Carthage would be the one not only to survive, but to ascend to greatness. Founded, according to tradition, around 814 before Christ by Dido, a princess from Tyre fleeing palace conflicts, the city quickly grew on a secure peninsula in the Gulf of Tunis, nestled between the Sahara Desert and the endless blue of the sea. Carthage's geographic location was a strategic gift, protected by natural lagoons and peninsulas that allowed for solid fortifications, and with privileged access to maritime routes linking east and west, the city soon became a vital commercial hub. Unlike Rome, which was essentially a land-based power, Carthage shaped itself as a port city. Its heart did not beat for the clash of swords, but for the clink of coins. Its ships, hundreds of them, ploughed the Mediterranean waters carrying tin from Britain, gold from sub-Saharan Africa, silver from Iberia, grain from the Nile Delta, olive oil from Hispania, Phoenician purple dye, Greek ceramics, and Etruscan wine. Carthage was the warehouse of the ancient world, and the Carthaginians, its merchant lords. This mercantile vocation was not a sign of weakness. On the contrary, the city built one of the most advanced navies of its time. Its ports, true wonders of engineering, featured circular docks, segmented warehouses, and hidden channels that allowed for quick entry and exit of vessels. It is estimated that Carthage's military harbor could house more than 200 ships simultaneously, and those ships were anything but fragile. They were swift triremes with reinforced prows for ramming, trained rowers, and refined naval tactics inherited from the Greeks and perfected by the Carthaginians themselves. When Carthage wanted to control a region, it did not need to march. It simply blocked its ports. The city's political structure also reflected its pragmatism. Governed by a mixed aristocratic system, Carthage had two suffetes, annually elected magistrates with executive powers, as well as a council of elders, the Carthaginian Senate, and a powerful assembly of the 100. Direct democracy, as in Athens, never flourished there, nor did the military authoritarianism of Sparta. Carthage was ruled by wealthy merchants with clear objectives to protect trade routes, increase profits, and avoid at all costs wars that could threaten commerce. Its diplomacy was sharp, its espionage active, and its currency accepted across much of the known world, but beneath the golden glow there were shadows. Carthage was also a hierarchical city, where an extremely wealthy elite ruled over a vast population of peasants, foreigners, and slaves. Its land forces, unlike its naval efficiency, were composed mostly of mercenaries, Numidian Africans, Iberians, Gauls, and Greeks. These paid armies, although numerous, lacked absolute loyalty. For this reason, even with its wealth, Carthage hesitated to expand through force, fearing its own soldiers, motivated solely by gold, might turn against it. This would become tragically evident after the First Punic War, in what would be known as the Mercenary Wars. Carthaginian religion, deeply tied to Phoenician tradition, also provoked unease among outsiders. Its chief deities, Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, were associated with fire, fertility, and the agricultural cycle. But Carthage also became infamous for ritual practices that shocked neighboring civilizations, child sacrifice. Although there is modern scholarly debate over the scale and nature of these rites, Roman and Greek records, along with archaeological findings in Tophets, cemeteries dedicated to children, suggest that ceremonies involving the sacrifice of newborns to the gods did indeed occur. For the Romans, this was more than repulsive. It was demonic, and this perception would be exploited to the fullest in future propaganda campaigns. Over the centuries, Carthage expanded its dominion far beyond its mother city. It had colonies and outposts across North Africa, the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Corsica, and especially the resource-rich Iberian Peninsula. There, it mined silver and forged alliances with local tribes, building what were essentially satellite states. This expansion, although peaceful in appearance, was a constant irritation for Greeks, Etruscans, and eventually Romans. Carthage's wealth, its navy, its aggressive diplomacy, and its ability to control entire markets without firing a single arrow made it, in the eyes of many, a silent yet colossal threat. Still, for nearly 4 centuries, Carthage coexisted with its rivals. It was feared but respected. Its economic stability and naval power functioned like an invisible shield. Rome, until then, had not ventured beyond the Italian peninsula. But the world was changing. And Rome, with its thirst for glory, riches, and honor, began to look beyond the Apennines. It began to eye the islands, the seas, the ports. It began to see Carthaginian supremacy as an affront to its vocation as a universal power. And thus, slowly, the routes that once linked Rome and Carthage through commerce began to fill with swords, shields, and hidden intentions. When Sicily erupted in tension, and cities like Messana called for aid from greater powers, the stage was set. Carthage, despite its strength, hesitated. Rome, even without a navy, advanced. Diplomacy gave way to strategy, and strategy to war. A war that, for Carthage, was unwanted, but once begun, would reveal both the greatness and the vulnerabilities of a city that ruled the seas, yet underestimated the legions. In the same century that Carthage ruled the seas with its mercantile fleet and imposed its presence through gold and diplomacy, Rome was consolidating its hegemony over the Italian peninsula with a different kind of power: war. Unlike the African city, which preferred to avoid direct conflict, Rome was born and raised in the midst of it. Every hill conquered, every treaty signed, and every city annexed had been the result of bloody battles and relentless military campaigns. The Roman Republic, forged in wars against the Etruscans, Latins, Samnites, and the Greeks of Magna Graecia, had developed a state structure almost entirely oriented toward perpetual war, a machine that never stopped, that adapted, that learned from defeats and turned them into stepping stones for future victories. The Republic of Rome was not a democracy in the modern sense, but it was not a tyranny either. It was a mixed system in which power was shared among aristocrats, the patricians, and to a lesser extent the plebeians, through a complex web of magistracies, assemblies, and councils. At the top stood the 2 consuls, elected annually, who commanded the army and presided over the Senate. They were replaced each year to prevent the accumulation of power, though in practice their terms were often extended during wartime or masked through succession by allies. Surrounding them, the Senate, composed of former magistrates, wielded monumental influence, not only directing foreign policy and managing public finances, but also dictating the pace of military expansion. But the true engine of the Republic was its army. The Roman legions were not a makeshift gathering of fighters. They were permanent institutions with clearly defined hierarchies, rigorous training methods, and a discipline that bordered on fanaticism. Each legionary, a citizen between 17 and 46 years old, was obligated to serve for several years, providing his own equipment. This made the Roman army a force composed of men with something to lose: land, families, honor. They fought with their bodies but also with their pride. With each new campaign, Rome absorbed soldiers from allied peoples, the Bsoc, who, even without full citizenship, were required to provide troops. In this way, a Roman legion marched with the combined strength of the entire peninsula, increasing its ranks without exhausting the mother city. Roman military tactics also stood out for their pragmatic efficiency. After learning from the mistakes of the Samnite Wars and the conflicts with Pyrrhus of Epirus, Rome abandoned the phalanx formations inherited from the Greeks and developed the immanipular system, dividing legions into small mobile units called immaniples, arranged in 3 lines: the Ciostati Tiu, younger and less experienced; the Principes, more mature and better armed; and the Triarii, elite veterans used only as a last resort. This structure allowed for flexibility, rapid rotation in battle, and adaptation to terrain, something the rigid Carthaginian and Greek formations could not match. Roman strategy went beyond the battlefield. It was political, diplomatic, and cultural warfare. After each victory, Rome did not merely impose tribute. It founded colonies, built roads, dispatched administrators, and integrated local elites into its system. The defeated were not destroyed, but assimilated. Cities received the status of dure municipia or colonia, could retain part of their traditions, but owed loyalty to the Republic. It was a web of control that expanded with each campaign, until, by the end of the 3rd century before Christ, the Italian peninsula was almost entirely Roman, not through destruction but through absorption. This expansion, however, was not without tension. Senators enriched themselves through war, acquiring land and slaves, while small landowners fell into poverty. The plebs protested, demanding reforms. Tribunes emerged, trying to curb aristocratic excesses. But in times of war, unity prevailed. The external enemy always united the Romans, and Carthage, with its naval power and influence in Sicily, was soon identified as the next necessary target to ensure the security and prestige of the Republic. Roman culture, deeply rooted in the values of a disciplined virtues and reverence for ancestors, viewed war as a sacred duty. The Temple of Janus, whose doors were opened in times of conflict and closed in times of peace, stood almost always wide open. War to the Roman was not an exception. It was the natural state of political existence. It was in war that men proved their worth, gained glory, political ascent, and family prestige. It was the battlefield that forged the great names of the Senate and the grand narratives that filled the annals of history. This culture of systematic and constant conquest pushed Rome inexorably beyond its borders. It was no longer enough to dominate Latium, Etruria, or Campania. Now Roman eyes turned south, to Sicily, where Greeks and Carthaginians were locked in a struggle for supremacy. The city of Messana, besieged by Syracuse and fearing it might fall under the control of forces allied to Carthage, called for aid, and Rome, under the pretext of protecting its allies, intervened. In practice, this seemingly minor gesture was the spark for a war of unprecedented proportions. It was the first time Rome reached beyond the continent, dared to face a naval power, and took the risk of challenging a city so rich, so distant, and so different. But Rome did not hesitate in the face of risk. Its generals saw an opportunity for glory, its senators a chance for economic domination, and the people a promise of new lands, plunder, and victory. Thus, with the crossing into Sicily, the Republic stepped across a threshold. It was no longer merely an Italian power. It was an emerging force, hungry, disciplined, and unstoppable. In the year 264 before Christ, the ancient world witnessed the awakening of a conflict that would not only transform the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean, but would also ignite a brutal rivalry lasting more than a century. This confrontation, born not from a grand formal declaration between empires, but from a local dispute over a strategic city, lit the spark of the First Punic War, a war that would reveal Rome's expansionist potential and expose Carthage's internal contradictions. And it all began in one specific spot on the map, the city of Messana, at the northeastern tip of Sicily. Messana, located directly across from the strait that separates the island from the Italian peninsula, was a crucial point for any power seeking to control Sicily. At the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, the city was under the control of the Mamertines, a group of Italic mercenaries originally hired by Agathocles of Syracuse, who had seized the city by force and established their own dominion. Lacking political legitimacy, but holding a militarily advantageous position, the Mamertines soon became targets of their rival city, Syracuse, which sought to reclaim control of the region. The tyrant of Syracuse at the time, Herodotus, laid siege to Messana with full force, promising to restore order and eliminate the mercenaries. Isolated and without resources, the Mamertines sought protection, and in that moment, the gears of fate began to turn. Curiously, they sent envoys to both Rome and Carthage pleading for aid. Carthage, acting swiftly, responded first. A Carthaginian garrison was dispatched to the city, and its forces took up positions in Messana and its harbor, shielding it from the Syracusan siege. Carthage's interests in the region were clear: to maintain indirect control over Sicily and prevent Rome from establishing any military presence there. But Rome also responded to the call. The Senate, divided over the wisdom of intervening on an island, where it had never fought before, hesitated. Supporting rogue mercenaries and directly challenging a power like Carthage was no simple decision. However, the consuls saw a strategic opportunity to expand Roman influence beyond the peninsula and to test the boundaries of Carthaginian resolve. More than that, Roman pride could not tolerate Carthaginian influence stretching into the Strait of Messina, so close to their own territory. War, though undeclared, was already smoldering. The Senate, after intense debate, authorized the expedition. The consul Appius Claudius Caudex, charged with the mission, crossed the strait with his troops. The Romans' arrival was immediately followed by diplomatic tension. Carthage, already stationed in Messana, viewed the move as a direct provocation. Hero of Syracuse, for his part, wavered between confronting the Romans and negotiating with them. Within days, the Romans persuaded the Mamertines to surrender the city, expelled the Carthaginians, and faced the Syracusan forces with astonishing audacity. Rome, lacking a navy of its own, had landed on hostile ground, seized a strategic position, and challenged two established powers. It was the unmistakable prelude to war. Carthage reacted swiftly. Its forces counterattacked, and hostilities quickly escalated. The skirmishes around Messana spread rapidly across Sicily. What had begun as a localized intervention transformed into a full-scale conflict. The city-states of Sicily, caught between loyalty to Carthage, forced neutrality, or alliance with Rome, were pulled into the vortex of war. Syracuse, witnessing Rome's advance and fearing isolation, quickly abandoned its alliance with Carthage and forged a treaty with Rome, a decisive move that weakened Carthage's position on the island and strengthened Roman ambitions. But Rome now faced an unprecedented challenge. It was waging war on an island against a naval power, without possessing a fleet worthy of the name. Until that point, Roman legions had fought almost exclusively on land, in the fields, forests, and hills of Italy. Now Rome faced an enemy that had ruled the sea for centuries. To continue the war, a technological leap was needed, a logistical audacity, the construction, from nothing, of a navy capable of facing Carthage on equal footing. The decision was made with speed and conviction. Rome built, in record time, a fleet of over 100 warships, triremes and quinqueremes, modeled after a single captured Carthaginian vessel, which was studied in minute detail. The Roman innovation did not lie in the ship design, but in the implementation of the corvus tool, a mobile boarding bridge with hooks that allowed Roman soldiers to storm enemy ships and turn naval combat into hand-to-hand land battles. It was the perfect adaptation. The Romans knew they could not surpass Carthaginian naval experience, but they could level the playing field by bringing the fight to their strength, close combat. In the following years, war engulfed all of Sicily. Cities were besieged, fortifications built, and alliances constantly shifting. The campaigns became long, complex, and bloody. Carthage proved resilient, but internally divided. Its generals vied for glory, its mercenary armies were not always reliable, and its supply lines, despite its naval power, suffered under Roman strikes. Rome, on the other hand, demonstrated astounding adaptability. Every defeat was followed by reconstruction, every naval loss by a new fleet. The war, which at first seemed to favor the masters of the sea, began to tilt in favor of the masters of the land. The First Punic War, born from a dispute over a mercenary city, revealed in its early years the deeper forces driving the two powers. Carthage, defensive, fought to preserve its supremacy. Rome, offensive, used the conflict as a springboard to a new level of power. It was not merely the beginning of a war, it was the beginning of what would become the inevitable destiny of the Mediterranean, its Romanization. When Rome, an essentially land-based power, decided to challenge Carthage in the maritime domain, many saw the move not only as bold, but as outright reckless. Carthage had centuries of naval supremacy, boasting victories in wars, blockades, and maritime patrols across nearly the entire western Mediterranean. Its ships were swift, its sailors experienced, and its supply routes solid. Rome, on the other hand, had no naval tradition. Its armed forces, the feared legions, had never fought on open water, and Roman naval engineering was rudimentary at best. Yet the genius of Rome did not lie solely in brute strength, but in its capacity for adaptation, improvisation, and learning, especially in the context of war. Thus was born one of the most remarkable turning points of the First Punic War, the invention of the corvus, a boarding bridge that would redefine naval combat and shift the balance of power. After the initial confrontations in Sicily, Rome realized it could not defeat Carthage through land forces alone. The islands were supplied by sea, armies were transported by ships, and decisive battles would unfold in the waters surrounding the ports. It became necessary then to build a navy from scratch, a colossal task, but one that Rome embraced with characteristic determination. Legend holds that the Romans captured a stranded Carthaginian ship and used it as a model for the mass production of quinqueremes, large warships with 5 rows of oarsmen. Naval workshops were hastily erected, craftsmen summoned from all over Italy, and within months a brand new fleet was ready for action. But the Romans knew they would not win by numbers alone. They lacked the Carthaginians' maritime skill, mastery of maneuvers, and knowledge of currents and winds. These advantages needed to be neutralized, and the answer came in one of the simplest yet deadliest military inventions of the ancient world, the hassus, corvus. Named after the Latin word for raven, due to the shape of its hooked end, the corvus was a wooden bridge affixed to the bow of Roman ships and mounted on a rotating mast. As Roman vessels approached their enemies, the corvus was violently dropped, embedding its spike into the enemy's deck and forming a passageway. From there, Roman tactics took over. Soldiers crossed the corvus in formation, turning naval combat into a traditional land battle, where Roman superiority reigned. Its effectiveness was first demonstrated at the Battle of Mylae in 260 before Christ. Under the command of consul Gaius Duilius, the Romans faced the Carthaginian navy in open sea. The Carthaginians, confident in their agility and naval tradition, attacked aggressively, but they were caught off guard by the corvus. One by one, their ships were boarded and overwhelmed in hand-to-hand combat, for which their crews were unprepared. The result was a crushing Roman victory. Dozens of Carthaginian ships captured or sunk. For the first time, a land-based power had defeated the masters of the sea in their own arena, and the cause was a simple contraption of wood and iron. The victory at Mylae was not merely a tactical success. It had deep political repercussions. The Senate awarded Gaius Duilius a triumph, and in his honor a sached or rostral column, adorned with the spoils of captured Carthaginian ships, was erected in the Roman Forum. The Roman people saw in that triumph a sign that the gods favored the Republic, and that no frontier, not even the sea, was insurmountable. Morale soared, and new waves of resources were allocated to expanding the fleet. In the following years, Rome continued to invest heavily in naval warfare. The corvus became standard in the Roman fleet, and more victories were secured using it. At the Battle of Sulci in Sardinia, and later at Mitindarista in Sicily, Rome's direct boarding tactics again frustrated Carthaginian expectations. For the first time, Carthage was forced to seriously consider the possibility of losing its maritime dominance, a scenario that had been unthinkable for decades. However, the corvus was not without drawbacks. Because it was a heavy and elevated structure, it made Roman ships less stable, especially in rough seas. In later confrontations, Rome would suffer significant losses due to shipwrecks, worsened by its inexperience at sea and over-reliance on technology without full mastery of the maritime environment. Even so, the strategic impact of the corvus was undeniable. It leveled the playing field, allowing Rome to fight on equal, or even superior, footing against a consolidated naval power. But more than just a boarding bridge, the corvus symbolized the Roman spirit, the ability to turn weaknesses into weapons, to defy established logic, and to reinvent war as needed. Carthage relied on tradition. Rome relied on adaptation. The First Punic War was still far from over, but the use of the corvus marked a new phase in the conflict. It was no longer merely a matter of holding or contesting positions in Sicily. Now it was about maritime supremacy, unrestricted access to the Mediterranean islands, and above all, the ability to project power across the waters. Rome, once confined to its territory, began to see the sea not as an obstacle but as a road, and the Carthaginian ships, once absolute rulers of the waves, began to sail in fear, not of the sea itself, but of the bridge that turned it into a Roman battlefield. Throughout the First Punic War, Sicily became not only a battlefield, but a mirror reflecting the strengths, weaknesses, and obsessions of both Rome and Carthage. That triangular island, with its fertile soil and strategic location, had for centuries been a point of contact and conflict between Greeks, Carthaginians, and indigenous Sicilian peoples. But now, more than ever, it had become the chessboard of a ruthless game. It was in Sicily that the true war of attrition was being waged, where the capture of each city, the siege of every fortress, and the subjugation of every village represented not merely military victories, but incremental advances in the struggle for imperial destiny. And no city better symbolized this phase of the war than Acragas, the ancient Greek stronghold that would become the focal point of a brutal siege. Acragas, formerly known as Agrigentum, had been one of the most prosperous Greek colonies in the west. Located on a plateau along Sicily's southwestern coast, it boasted solid walls, internal water sources, grand temples, and a location difficult for invading armies to access. Because of its position, it became a prime target for both Carthage and Rome. After its defeat at Mylae and the loss of Messana, Carthage, seeing its influence threatened, chose to reinforce its presence on the island. Acragas was transformed into the Carthaginian headquarters, receiving troops, supplies, and reinforcements. For Carthage, holding Acragas meant keeping alive the hope of territorial dominance in Sicily. For Rome, taking the city was a matter of both honor and strategic necessity. In the winter of 262 before Christ, Roman consuls Lucius Postumius Megellus and Quintus Mamilius Vitulus encircled the city with 8 legions, an exceptionally high number by the standards of the time. It was a siege designed to last. The Romans built fortified camps, cut off supply routes, and began a strategy of slow suffocation, relying on discipline and logistics to subdue the Carthaginians. Inside the city, the Carthaginian general, Hannibal Gisco, not to be confused with Hannibal Barca, commanded a large force which soon began to suffer from food shortages and declining morale. The situation worsened with each passing day, and psychological pressure became as effective a weapon as the catapults themselves. Realizing the imminent risk of losing Acragas, Carthage dispatched urgent reinforcements. An army led by Hanochaito, arriving from the island's interior, attempted to break the siege in a coordinated maneuver with the besieged defenders, but the Romans, anticipating the move, repelled the assault with ferocity. After months of stalemate, hunger, and despair within the city walls, Hannibal Gisco made the decision to evacuate the Carthaginian troops under the cover of night, abandoning the civilian population to their fate. When the Romans finally entered Acragas, they found no military resistance, only a starving and exhausted population. The city was looted and its inhabitants enslaved. The Roman victory was complete and brutal. The fall of Acragas was a turning point. It showed Sicily and the Roman Senate that Carthage was not invincible. It also proved that Rome was willing to use all means necessary to secure its presence beyond Italy. The message was clear. Those who resisted the Republic would pay the price. Cities allied with Carthage began to reconsider their loyalties. Some surrendered, others were taken by force. The war in Sicily became, from that point on, a succession of sieges, betrayals, unstable alliances, and grinding warfare. It was no longer a war of open-field engagements, but a slow erosion of Carthaginian territory. Carthage, for its part, began to shift its strategy. It understood that naval superiority was no longer sufficient, and that it needed to regain the trust of the Sicilian cities. Garrisons were reinforced, commanders changed, and efforts made to sway local leaders. But one structural problem remained unresolved. Carthage's army was largely composed of mercenaries, men who fought for pay, with no emotional attachment to the city or to the land they were defending. Roman soldiers, by contrast, fought for citizenship, honor, family glory, and increasingly for the promise of colonization and future wealth. That difference in motivation carried weight. The struggle for control of Sicily dragged on for years, with alternating successes. The Romans captured Enna Camarina and Panormus, solidifying their grip over the island's interior. Carthage, in turn, retained control of Lilybaeum and Drepana, fortified port cities vital to supply lines. These cities withstood long sieges, supported by Carthage's still relatively strong navy. Rome, despite the Corvus, continued to suffer shipwrecks, storms, and occasional defeats at sea. But on land, its domination steadily grew. This phase of the war revealed a fundamental trait of Roman politics: its refusal to accept stagnation. Whenever it suffered a loss, such as at the Battle of Drepana, where its fleet was destroyed, Rome immediately ordered the construction of new ships, the recruitment of new legions, the dispatch of new commanders. It was as though defeat only fueled the Republican war machine. Carthage, by contrast, constrained by internal conflict and a cautious mercantile government, showed hesitation, restraint, and a lack of unified strategic vision. By the end of this stage, with half of Sicily under Roman control and Carthage limited to a few defensive strongholds, the war entered its most cruel phase, a prolonged stalemate. Years would pass before a final outcome became possible. But the victory at Acragas left one lesson clear. Rome had crossed the sea, conquered foreign soil, and established itself as a power no longer content with Italy alone. The imperial project was beginning to take shape, and Sicily, once a Greek and Carthaginian outpost, was becoming more and more an extension of the Republic. After more than 2 decades of exhausting confrontations, prolonged sieges, naval setbacks, and land campaigns that devastated villages, colonies, and fortresses, the First Punic War approached its end, not through a sweeping victory, but through the progressive exhaustion of Carthage. The war, which had begun in 264 before Christ, became a conflict of attrition, in which Roman tenacity ultimately overcame Carthaginian sophistication. In the year 241 before Christ, Carthage, economically depleted, politically fragmented, and militarily cornered, was finally forced to kneel. But before the treaty, before the formal surrender, there was fire, there was destruction. There was the final collapse of a power that had once ruled the seas and now teetered at the edge of the abyss. The final phase of the war concentrated on the siege of the last Carthaginian strongholds in Sicily, Lilybaeum and Drepana. These cities, vital ports for maintaining African presence on the island, had resisted for years, sustained by a navy that still held some dominance over the western Mediterranean. Although the Romans had already captured most of Sicily, they struggled to break through these final defenses. The Carthaginian fleet, though weakened, continued to supply and reinforce these bastions, and as long as Lilybaeum held, Carthage could still negotiate under tolerable terms. But Rome, even after repeated shipwrecks and maritime losses, did not relent. On the contrary, its persistence bordered on the irrational. Every fleet lost was replaced by a larger one. The Republic's coffers were drained, citizens heavily taxed, and allies compelled to contribute. In 242 before Christ, the Senate organized a new and decisive naval force, funded in large part by private donations from the Roman aristocracy, which already viewed the war's conclusion as an opportunity for profit and prestige. Command was given to Gaius Lutatius Catulus, who quickly established an operational base near Drepana and subjected his sailors to intensive training, something uncommon by the standards of the time. The following year, in 241 before Christ, this new fleet met the Carthaginians in the Battle of the Aegates Islands, the engagement that would seal the war's fate. The Carthaginians, led by Hanno, were attempting to bring vital supplies to Lilybaeum, but they were intercepted. The Romans, aided by favorable winds and now operating lighter ships with more experienced crews than ever before, inflicted a crushing defeat. Nearly the entire Carthaginian fleet was captured or sunk. For the first time, Rome had defeated Carthage in a major naval confrontation without the use of the Corvus, a victory not only tactical but symbolic. Rome had learned to wage war at sea. The news of the disaster at the Aegates Islands struck Carthage like a lightning bolt. The city, already racked by internal revolts, political turmoil, and economic collapse, could no longer continue. Its army, composed mostly of mercenaries, threatened to turn against its own commanders for lack of pay. The generals were in disarray. The Carthaginian Senate, divided and desperate, finally resolved to send emissaries to Rome to negotiate terms of surrender. The conditions imposed by Rome were harsh. Carthage was to evacuate Sicily completely, renounce all claims to the island, and surrender all fortified cities. Additionally, it was required to pay a heavy war indemnity, 2,000 talents of silver over 10 years, plus an immediate payment of 1,000 talents. The Carthaginian navy would be severely restricted, and any future military activity in Sardinia and Corsica would be deemed a casus belli. Rome sought more than victory. It sought humiliation, containment, and submission. The treaty, known as the Treaty of Lutatius, was signed in haste. Carthage had no choice. Its pragmatic leaders knew that continuing the war would mean the city's annihilation. With the signing, the First Punic War was officially over. Rome emerged as the new master of Sicily, its first overseas province, while Carthage, though still powerful, entered a period of deep instability and vulnerability. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Internally, Carthage faced the mercenary war, a ferocious rebellion led by the very soldiers who had fought under its banner. Denied the wages they were promised and treated as disposable, these men turned on their former employers, looting cities and seizing control of parts of the African territory. Carthage was forced to fight a desperate war to reclaim its own land. It was a bloody, cruel conflict, marked by betrayals and massacres, a grim reflection of Carthage's reliance on foreign forces and the fragility of an empire built on gold rather than loyalty. Meanwhile, Rome capitalized on its victory. It consolidated its presence in Sicily by installing governors, founding colonies, and imposing taxes. It used the peace to reorganize its finances, strengthen its legions, and study the possibilities of new expansions. The Republic had learned that it could fight at sea, conquer lands beyond Italy, and subjugate rival powers through strategic patience. The imperial project was taking shape, and the First Punic War was its cornerstone. For Carthage, the end of the war was not an armistice, it was a suspended sentence. The city had been humiliated, economically plundered, and surrounded by constraints. Its elite did not forget the loss of Sicily. Its people, proud and defiant, refused to accept their new role as informal vassals of Rome. And among the sons of that humiliation, one name began to rise in silence. A boy, still young, had witnessed the surrender with eyes full of hatred and unspoken oaths. His name was Hannibal, and he, more than anyone, would carry within him the fury of a wounded nation. The signing of the Treaty of Lutatius in 241 before Christ formally ended the First Punic War, but it did not bring peace to Carthage. On the contrary, what followed was one of the most unstable, bloody, and self-destructive periods in Carthaginian history. Although physically spared by the war, the city fell into internal convulsion. Wounded in its pride, economically bleeding, and divided among rival political factions, Carthage did not even have time to bury its dead before being dragged into a new nightmare, the revolt of its own soldiers. This was the beginning of the mercenary war, a conflict so brutal and shameful that even ancient chroniclers referred to it as the inexpiable war, a war that left no room for forgiveness. For more than 20 years of conflict with Rome, Carthage had maintained much of its army through mercenaries hired from various regions: Numidians, Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Italics, men willing to fight for pay, with no cultural ties to the city, but whose courage and experience were undeniable. After the defeat at the Aegates Islands and the formal surrender in 241 before Christ, Carthage, economically exhausted and politically disorganized, failed to fulfill the payments promised to these soldiers. The debt was enormous. The mercenaries, who had fought bravely, many of them for years on end far from their homelands, now demanded compensation, and they demanded it immediately. The Carthaginian government, led by aristocratic factions more interested in preserving their own privileges than in stabilizing the state, tried to maneuver. First, it promised partial payments. Then, it proposed cuts. Later, it demanded that the mercenaries disperse and return to their lands, trusting in vague promises of future payment. This sequence of catastrophic decisions not only generated distrust, but also ignited the soldiers' anger. Gathered near the city of Sicca in northern Africa, they organized under new leaders, men hardened by war, now filled with resentment. Among the revolt's leaders was Mathos, a Libyan who denounced the exploitation of his people at the hands of the Carthaginian elite. Another prominent figure was Spendius, a runaway Roman slave who feared being handed over to his enemies if he returned to the city. These men inflamed the rebel army with speeches about betrayal, injustice, and vengeance. Thus, from unpaid soldiers, they became armed insurgents. The spark was immediate. The troops marched toward Carthage. Nearby cities were looted. Villages pledged loyalty to the rebels, either out of conviction or fear. What had begun as a protest turned into total civil war. In desperation, Carthage summoned Hannibal Gisco to attempt peace negotiations. But he was captured by the mercenaries and executed in barbaric fashion. His body dismembered, the parts thrown in contempt at the city that had sent him. From that moment, there was no turning back. The war took on the character of carnage. The mercenaries imposed a brutal siege on Carthage itself, blocked supply routes, incited rebellions throughout African territory, and threatened to extinguish the very civilization that had once dominated the seas. The situation became so dire that Carthage, in a historic reversal, was forced to turn to an old enemy, Rome. Rome, for its part, watched the events with calculated interest. On one hand, it saw in Carthage's civil war an opportunity. A disorganized Carthage posed no future threat. On the other hand, it feared that the city's total collapse could open the door to new and undesirable powers in the region. Thus, Rome maintained an ambiguous position. It did not intervene militarily, but reinforced its presence on nearby islands like Sardinia and Corsica. Carthage protested, claiming a violation of the peace treaty. Rome ignored the protests. In 238 before Christ, taking advantage of Carthaginian weakness, it occupied Sardinia and officially annexed the island. To justify the action, it accused Carthage of hostility. As additional punishment, it demanded a new payment of 200 silver talents. Humiliated and without options, Carthage yielded. The loss of Sardinia was a brutal blow. The city, already struggling to pay the previous war indemnity, now found itself stripped of yet another vital resource. The Carthaginian elite plunged into crisis. Internal factions clashed in the Senate, some advocating appeasement with Rome, others calling for future revenge. The Carthaginian generals, now led by Hannibal Barca, father of Hannibal, finally managed to regain control over the mercenaries after extermination campaigns so brutal they shocked even Roman observers. The mercenary war was won, but the cost was immense. Carthage emerged from the revolt further impoverished, its moral authority shattered, and its regional hegemony dissolved. In this context of crisis, Hannibal Barca rose as the savior of the city. His military prestige and leadership during the darkest moments of the conflict earned him not only popular respect, but also political control over Carthage's military affairs. However, Hamilcar was not a man of peace. Deep within, he nurtured a desire for revenge, and it was with that goal in mind that, with the Senate's approval, he set out for the Iberian Peninsula, where he would begin the silent reconstruction of Carthaginian power. In Hispania, Hamilcar would begin to build what Rome ignored: a new army, a new empire, a new generation of warriors. Among them, his own son, Hannibal, who even as a youth accompanied his father's campaigns, learning tactics, diplomacy, command, and above all, unconditional hatred for the Republic that had humiliated his homeland. It was there that Hannibal would swear, before the altar of the gods, that he would never accept Rome as the ruler of the world. The interval between the Punic Wars, which many believed to be a time of peace, was in truth a cycle of festering hatred, strategic rebuilding, and veiled preparation for a second act. Rome, triumphant, focused on consolidating its new provinces and controlling trade. Carthage, wounded, silent but not defeated, was sowing the seeds of a new war. A war that would not begin on the open sea, nor at Carthage's walls, but in the heart of the Iberian Peninsula, and in the eyes of a young man who would never forgive. In the history of humankind, few names evoke fear, respect, and admiration all at once as powerfully as Hannibal Barca. Son of Carthage, forged in war and shaped by his homeland's humiliation, Hannibal embodied, like no one else, the Carthaginian response to Rome's rise. He was more than a general. He was the symbol of an empire's wounded resistance, the herald of a revenge long nurtured and strategically conceived. The Roman world would learn the hard way that Carthage still breathed, and that from the womb of defeat, a genius had been born, capable of threatening the very survival of the Republic. And it all began in the Iberian Peninsula, where the name Hannibal would become legend before he ever crossed the Alps. Hannibal was born around 247 before Christ, within the powerful Barca family, an aristocratic lineage of warriors, diplomats, and statesmen who emerged as Carthage's new military leadership following the mercenary war. His father, Hannibal Barca, had brutally crushed the rebellion, and was the architect of Carthage's western realignment, seeking to rebuild the city's power far from Rome's direct influence. He began the systematic conquest of Iberia, not merely as a colony, but as a strategic base for a future confrontation. Hamilcar understood that Rome, by nature an expansionist force, would never allow a revitalized Carthage. War, to him, was inevitable, and he prepared his sons accordingly. Hannibal's oath, though wrapped in the mists of tradition, was preserved by both Roman and Carthaginian historians. The boy, around 9 years old, was led by his father to the altar of Baal Hammon, and there solemnly swore never to be a friend of Rome. This vow, more than a ceremonial formula, would define his entire life. Educated on battlefields, alongside his father and brother-in-law Hasdrubal, Hannibal learned not only the art of war, but the political management of Iberian tribes, the value of discipline, the power of silence, and the importance of audacity. He grew up among armies, maps, and conspiracies. He did not know childhood, he knew vengeance. With Hamilcar's death in battle, and later that of Hasdrubal, Hannibal was elected supreme commander of Carthaginian forces in Hispania at the age of 26, young by the standards of the time, but already mature in worldview. His leadership began with decisive campaigns. He subdued rebellious tribes, fortified garrisons, founded cities such as Carthago Nova, and above all, secured the region's silver mines under the direct control of the Barcid family, ensuring resources to finance an army independent of the Carthaginian Senate. He did not merely command soldiers, he was creating a new Carthage on foreign soil. But Hannibal knew that revenge against Rome required more than brute force. It demanded a calculated provocation, a move that would force the Romans to respond, and legitimize the war without appearing as direct Carthaginian aggression. That spark would be the city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome but located south of the Ebro River, a region that, by previous agreements, was recognized as Carthaginian influence. In 219 before Christ, Hannibal besieged and captured Saguntum, ignoring Roman diplomatic protests. The city resisted fiercely, but fell. Rome's reaction was immediate. The Senate sent envoys to Carthage demanding Hannibal's surrender. The Carthaginian response was proud and laconic: total refusal. War was declared. It was the year 218 before Christ, and so began the Second Punic War, a conflict that would transcend the boundaries of traditional strategy and transform Hannibal into Rome's most feared enemy. But he did not wait for the Roman advance. On the contrary, he took the initiative with a boldness never seen before. Instead of awaiting invasion in Hispania or preparing Africa's defenses, Hannibal assembled a heterogeneous army: Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, Carthaginians, and launched one of the most insane campaigns in military history: the crossing of the Alps. The plan was so audacious that many deemed it suicidal. Hannibal intended to march through Gaul, traverse hostile territories, scale the most fearsome mountains of Europe with men, horses, elephants, and supplies, and then descend into Italy, striking Rome where it least expected, its own soil. It was a march against the impossible, against logic, against the gods themselves, and Hannibal, with unmatched cunning, initiated the movement before Rome grasped the true magnitude of the threat. During the crossing, he faced hostile tribes, avalanches, betrayals, and disease. It is estimated that he lost half his army. But upon reaching the Po Valley, Hannibal achieved the impossible. He emerged in Italy with an army ready for war, battered but unbroken, while Rome was still mobilizing its legions to fight in Hispania. It was a maneuver that redefined the war and the fate of the Republic. Hannibal's presence in the Italian peninsula shattered all of Rome's strategic calculations. For over a decade, he would lead devastating campaigns, inflicting humiliating defeats on the legions and setting Italy ablaze. But more than that, his figure became a myth, the commander who appeared where he was least expected, who read enemy movements before they were made, who treated war like chess and his adversaries as pawns to be sacrificed. In Hannibal, Carthage found not just a hero, but a strategist who exceeded all boundaries of military tradition. He combined tactical intelligence, physical endurance, logistical mastery, and unmatched charisma. His men followed him not for pay, but out of faith, and Rome, for the first time, knew the taste of real fear. But Hannibal's story on Roman soil was only beginning. The battles of Utrebia, Lake Trasimene and Lucane still lay ahead. Legions would still be destroyed, alliances would still be tested, and Rome's destiny, for the first time in centuries, would hang by a thread, the thread of one man's will, who had never forgotten his childhood oath. In the pantheon of the most audacious military campaigns in history, the crossing of the Alps by Hannibal Barca in the year 218 before Christ remains unmatched, not merely because of its logistical daring or the natural challenges it imposed, but because in its inaugural gesture it reconfigured the geopolitical axis of the Mediterranean. It was not just a march, it was a declaration of war against expectations, against physical limits, and against the pride of Rome. By climbing the rocky spine of Europe with tens of thousands of men, horses, supplies, and even war elephants, Hannibal did not merely seek to enter Italy. He intended to rip open the entrails of the Republic, from the north, through the mountains, through sheer audacity. Hannibal's decision to cross the Alps was as surprising as it was calculated. After taking Saguntum and provoking Rome's declaration of war, he knew the enemy anticipated a conventional confrontation. Rome would send its legions to Hispania or Africa, and Carthage would respond in open field. But Hannibal, well versed in Roman mentality, knew that to defeat an empire whose strength lay in strategic repetition, one had to act asymmetrically. His proposal was simple and terrifying. Avoid defensive battles, cross Gaul swiftly, traverse the Alps before winter, and emerge in the heart of the Italian peninsula before Rome could react. It was the plan of a genius and a madman. His army, initially estimated at around 90,000 men and 12,000 cavalry, included Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, and Carthaginians, an ethnic mosaic united by loyalty to a commander who inspired both fear and admiration. The march through Gaul began with diplomacy and cunning. Hannibal preferred negotiation whenever possible, using promises and threats to secure safe passage, but not all tribal leaders yielded. The crossing of the Haron River was marked by combat, with Roman troops approaching from the south and hostile tribes attacking his columns. Even so, Hannibal managed to construct rafts, cross the river with his entire cavalry, and execute diversionary maneuvers that confused his pursuers. Speed and ingenuity were his main weapons. As he neared the mountains, Hannibal faced his first major obstacle, the karst Alps, formidable, steep, snow-covered, and watched by hostile tribes. His decision to press on regardless reveals not only courage, but a rare strategic coldness. The Alps, with their narrow paths, vertical cliffs, and frequent avalanches, represented a graveyard for any army. The Gallic guides hired by Hannibal often betrayed the route or abandoned the convoys. Snowstorms obscuring trails, landslides, falling rocks, surprise attacks by mountain tribes, all turned the march into a nightmare. But Hannibal persisted. He faced each obstacle one by one, motivating his men with speeches, rewards, and, most of all, his constant presence on the front lines. The elephants, perhaps the most powerful symbol of the crossing, were both a weapon of war and psychological terror. Majestic creatures, never seen before by the peoples of northern Italy. They were feared and revered in equal measure, but in the mountains they became a burden. Many perished from cold, falls, or exhaustion, yet some survived, and the image of an African commander descending the Alps with elephants would become eternal. By the end of the crossing, Hannibal's army had been reduced to around 26,000 men. He had lost more than half his forces, but had gained something even more powerful: total surprise. When the Romans finally realized that Hannibal was not in Hispania, nor heading toward Africa, but already on Italian soil, it was too late. No fortresses protected the northern valleys. No legions had been deployed to block his descent. Hannibal had done the impossible, and in doing so, seized the strategic initiative of the war. His arrival in the Anpo River Valley was met with relief by several Gallic tribes, who hated Rome and saw in Hannibal a liberator. He quickly reinforced his troops with local warriors, resupplied his forces, and began a lightning campaign against the first Roman garrisons. The victory at the Scio Battle of the Ticinus, where his Numidian cavalry defeated Roman horsemen, led by Major Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of Scipio Africanus, marked the beginning of a series of triumphs that would define his Italian campaign. The crossing of the Alps was therefore more than a logistical feat. It was a political, strategic, and symbolic maneuver. It revealed to the world that Rome was not invulnerable, that its territory could be invaded, that its superiority could be challenged, and more, that Carthage, though wounded, still possessed leaders capable of reversing the course of history. Every step in those cold mountains was a refusal to conform, a scream against surrender, a proclamation of total war. From that moment on, Hannibal would dominate the battlefields of Italy for more than 15 years. He would destroy legions, turn cities against the Republic, and become the nightmare of generations of senators and generals. But none of it would have been possible without that inaugural gesture, without that impossible march. Hannibal, upon descending from the Alps, was no longer merely a commander. He was a force of nature, and Rome at last understood it was facing something far beyond conventional war. It was facing a man who had challenged the gods and won. In the summer of the year 216 before Christ, on the vast plains of Apulia, near the city of Cannae, the fate of the Roman Republic hung on the razor's edge of Hannibal Barca's military genius. What occurred there was not merely a battle. It was a lesson in tactics, an irreversible humiliation, a collective trauma that would echo through generations. The massacre at Cannae did not only expose Rome's vulnerabilities in the face of Carthaginian audacity, it proved to the world that a single man, armed with intelligence, audacity, and vision, could subdue the greatest army of its time with a flawless maneuver. That blood-soaked plain would forever be remembered as the stage where Rome, for the first time, glimpsed the real possibility of its own extinction. After Hannibal's victories at the Itzinus Kakin the Trebia and Lake Trasimene, Rome was in a state of shock. Never before had an enemy force moved so freely across Italian soil. Allied cities began to hesitate, some switching sides, and fear spread across the roads of the peninsula like a silent fever. The senators were torn between two extremes, the prudence represented by Fabius Maximus, who advocated a war of attrition and avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal, and the warmongering urgency of an aristocracy desperate for a quick, decisive victory to restore the Republic's honor. In this atmosphere of tension and wounded pride, Rome, in the year 216 before Christ, summoned one of the largest armies in its history, around 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, under the command of two consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Victus Gaius Terentius Varro. The choice of two generals with such distinct personalities proved from the beginning to be a risk. Aemilius Paulus was cautious, observant, an advocate of restraint. Varro, a plebeian of humble origins and a fiery spirit, sought a swift victory, even at the cost of prudence. Command alternated between them daily, an organizational weakness that Hannibal would exploit masterfully. Hannibal, in contrast, had about 50,000 men, many weary but loyal unto death. He knew he was outnumbered, but also knew he was superior in morale, tactics, and leadership. He deliberately chose the battlefield at Cannae, an open plain crossed by the Aufidus River, with constant winds and uneven terrain. There he orchestrated the most famous double envelopment maneuver in ancient history, a movement so precise, so lethal, that it is still studied by generals to this day. The morning of the battle began with the Roman army deployed in traditional formation, legions massed in the center, flanked by cavalry. Confident in their numerical superiority, the Romans aimed to break through the enemy center with brute force. Hannibal, however, arranged his troops in an unusual formation. The Gauls and Iberians formed a convex front, curving toward the enemy like a bow, while the veteran African soldiers were stationed behind in an oblique line. On the flanks, the Numidian cavalry, led by Maharbal, waited in silence. The battle began with the Roman legions charging into the Carthaginian center. As Hannibal had predicted, the Gauls and Iberians slowly gave way, retreating with control, drawing the Romans into the trap. To the Roman generals, this looked like imminent victory. The enemy's center was collapsing, the advance was constant, the Roman force was crushing the Carthaginian line. But this was the plan all along. As the Romans pressed deeper into the crumbling center, the African flanks, composed of seasoned troops, moved silently on the diagonal, collapsing onto the Roman sides. When both flanks closed in on the Roman formation, the encirclement began. Simultaneously, the Carthaginian cavalry, having already defeated the Roman horsemen, completed the maneuver by attacking from the rear. In minutes, 80,000 Roman soldiers were completely surrounded, crushed, with no room for maneuver, no communication between divisions, trapped in a funnel of flesh, blood, and panic. The massacre was total. Roman soldiers, compressed and immobile, suffocated, were trampled or killed by their own comrades before even facing enemy blades. It is estimated that over 50,000 Romans died that day alone. It was the deadliest and most efficient defeat in Roman history. Aemilius Paulus fell in combat. The other consul, Varro, managed to escape, but with his reputation in ruins. The senatorial elite saw their sons and brothers annihilated. Of the 80 command standards given to the legions, only one returned intact. Rome, for the first time in its history, was gripped by the real fear of annihilation. The city walls were reinforced, temples filled with desperate worshippers, citizens prepared for a siege that never came. Because Hannibal, after his perfect victory, did not march on Rome. That decision, still debated by historians today, sealed his fate. According to reports, his cavalry commander, Maharbal, told him, "You know how to win, Hannibal, but not how to use your victory." The decision not to attack Rome immediately may have been strategic. The city still had military reserves, its walls were formidable, and Hannibal's supply lines were strained. But the fact remains, Rome survived. And more than that, it rose, because the defeat at Cannae, rather than destroying the Republic, ignited a new kind of fire within it. The Romans, like a wounded beast, reorganized their structures, adopted a direct avoidance tactic, strengthened their allies, and launched a war of attrition that would turn Hannibal from hunter to hunted. But that day at Cannae, under the scorching Apulian sun, Hannibal became immortal. He had created the whole perfect victory, destroyed the heart of the Roman aristocracy, and redefined the art of war. His name would echo through the centuries, and Rome would never forget that moment when death came so close and almost took everything. After the cataclysm at Cannae, Rome bled, but did not fall. Hannibal's victory, though total on the battlefield, proved insufficient to break the moral spine of a republic whose foundation was cemented not only by the strength of its legions, but by a nearly mystical obstinacy for survival. The city, haunted by its losses, saw the Senate enter a state of permanent session. Human sacrifices, something exceedingly rare in Roman ritual, were performed to appease the gods. The gates of the Pantheon were left open day and night, and crowds of citizens pressed together to offer sacrifices in silence. The shadow of Hannibal loomed over the rooftops, but the soul of Rome, paradoxically, grew stronger. It was the birth of a new phase, the Saxwar of attrition. Long, methodical, and relentless, commanded by men who understood that victory would not come through immediate force, but through prolonged resistance. In this new scenario, a decisive figure emerged, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, the cunctator, the delayer. Appointed dictator after the tragedy at Cannae, Fabius imposed a strategy radically opposed to the belligerent mentality that dominated the Republic. Instead of confronting Hannibal in pitched battles, where the Carthaginian had proven tactically overwhelming, Fabius proposed total avoidance of direct confrontation. His legions would shadow Hannibal from a distance, wear down his supply lines, encircle cities under his influence, and retreat whenever the enemy sought engagement. It was a strategy of containment, not of glory. This stance earned him public contempt. He was branded a coward, accused of shaming Rome, ridiculed in the speeches of the tribunes, but Fabius knew Rome better than his critics. He knew the body of the Republic was too strong to die from a single blow, and that it was enough to slowly suffocate Hannibal, denying him food, allies, and visible victories, until the Italian people turned against the invader once more, and it worked. Over time, Fabius's tactic transformed from scorn into doctrine. Hannibal, master of swift movement and surprise, found himself ensnared in a land that neither fought him nor embraced him. The war then turned into one of prolonged sieges, ambushes on roads, indirect pursuits, corrupted alliances, and silent betrayals. Some Italian cities, especially in the south, remained loyal to Hannibal out of convenience or hope of liberation from Roman rule. But others, seeing that Rome still stood, hesitated. Rome, for its part, punished with severity all cities that declared loyalty to Carthage. Capua. For instance, the second largest city in Italy at the time was besieged, captured, and punished with exemplary harshness. Its elite was executed, its structures razed. The message was clear: no traitor would live to tell the tale. At the same time, the Roman Senate realized that containment alone would not win the war. It was necessary to prepare a new generation of commanders, young men unburdened by past defeats, but forged under the new paradigm of prolonged warfare. Among these names, one stood out with singular brilliance: Publius Cornelius Scipio, the younger, son of the consul who had been defeated at the Ticinus. Still very young during the events at Cannae, Scipio showed valor by rescuing the remnants of the Roman army and organizing its withdrawal. His charisma, political acumen, and moral conviction quickly made him a respected figure. Even amid the general despair, Scipio was assigned to fight in Hispania, where the Carthaginians, under Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Hannibal Barca, still controlled vast regions. It was there that the young general proved to be more than a promise. In a bold and meticulously executed campaign, Scipio captured the vital city of the Carthago Nova, New Carthage, in the year 209 before Christ, severing Carthaginian access to silver mines and breaking the logistical backbone of their presence on the peninsula. This conquest, achieved without direct aid from the Senate and with volunteer troops, projected Scipio as the most promising Roman strategist of his generation. But Scipio rose not only through military victories. His diplomatic skill was essential. Unlike previous generals, who treated the Iberians as barbarians to be subdued, Scipio respected their cultures, returned hostages, distributed wealth, and sealed lasting alliances. This won him not only loyal local soldiers, but also the stability needed for deeper campaigns. In a short time, the Carthaginians in Hispania were cornered, and Roman influence in the region surpassed that of the Barcids. Meanwhile, Hannibal remained in Italy, still dangerous, still lethal, but increasingly isolated, without reinforcements from Hispania, without consistent naval support, and with his Italian allies being slowly crushed by Rome. His position became unsustainable. Even so, he refused to retreat. His men, now veterans of over a decade of campaigning, continued to follow him with near religious devotion. But he could not attack Rome, and Rome refused to attack him directly. It was Scipio who understood that the war could not be won on Italian soil. The conflict had to be taken back to Africa, forcing Carthage to summon Hannibal home to defend it, and thus reverse the roles of the war. Scipio presented his plan to the Senate. Many hesitated, but the balance was already tipping in his favor. In the year 205 before Christ, after conquering all of Hispania, Scipio received authorization to launch the African campaign. He took with him seasoned troops, allied Numidians, and a strategic vision never before seen: to defeat Hannibal not in Italy, but in his own backyard, on the soil where Carthaginian pride still held fast. The war was entering its final chapter, but the Republic had already been reborn. Rome, which had survived the abyss of Cannae, which had learned restraint under Fabius Maximus, and which now dared again with Scipio, had become more dangerous than ever. Carthage, for its part, would realize too late that victory on the battlefield was not enough against an enemy that refused to die, and now marched with purpose to end, once and for all, the war that had begun with a boy's oath. The plain of Zama, in North Africa, witnessed in the year 202 before Christ the final clash between two of the greatest strategists of antiquity: Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian genius who for over 15 years haunted the Italian peninsula, and Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young Roman general who, after conquering Hispania and marching upon Africa, had forced Carthage to summon Hannibal home to defend his homeland. There, before the gods, the legions, and history itself, the Second Punic War came to an end in a battle as symbolic as it was decisive. Rome and Carthage were not merely testing strength, they were measuring destinies. Zama was more than a military victory. It was the accent of an era. With Scipio's African campaign advancing successfully, the Carthaginians found themselves compelled to negotiate peace. But the talks were abruptly broken off when Hannibal, still in Italy, was finally recalled. It was an act born of both desperation and hope. Carthage acknowledged that only one man might save her. Hannibal landed in North Africa with the veteran remnants of his long Italian campaign, men who had fought at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, now more ghosts than soldiers, but still fiercely loyal. Gathering new local troops, he formed a heterogeneous army, numerous but unbalanced. It was the final wager of a besieged empire. On the other side, Scipio prepared meticulously. Since arriving in Africa, he had allied with the dissident Numidians led by Massinissa, sworn enemy of Carthage and master of the African terrain. His cavalry, composed of swift and disciplined Numidians, outmatched that of Hannibal, who relied on the forces of Syphax, Carthage's former Numidian ally, already defeated by Scipio months earlier. The Roman legions were rested, trained, and morally strengthened by a series of decisive victories. The balance between experience, discipline, and strategy was absolute. Scipio, fully aware of the greatness of the opponent he would face, was preparing not only for battle, but for entry into eternity. The meeting between Scipio and Hannibal before the battle, recorded by various chroniclers, was marked by tension and mutual respect. The Romans saw in the Carthaginian a master he now had to surpass. Hannibal, in turn, saw in Scipio the youth he had once been, and with bitter clarity understood that the tide of fortune had turned. They attempted one last time to avoid the conflict through negotiations that led nowhere. Both knew there was no turning back. It was war, for the city, for memory, for posterity. On the morning of Zama, the two armies faced each other under the open sky, without sieges or subterfuge. It was battle on pure ground. Hannibal arranged his infantry in 3 lines. The first, composed of mercenaries and light African troops, the second, made up of Carthaginian and Hispanic soldiers, and the third, the veterans of Italy, his elite. At the vanguard he positioned about 80 war elephants, his final gambit to break the Roman lines. Scipio in turn distributed his legions in spaced manipular formations, creating corridors between the troops, precisely to redirect the elephants. His cavalry, led by Massinissa, was positioned on the flanks, ready to envelop and crush. The battle began with a display of tactical precision. Scipio ordered his trumpeters to sound loudly, confusing and terrifying Hannibal's elephants. Many panicked and turned back, crashing into their own lines, spreading chaos. Those that did advance met the Roman corridors, fell into spear traps, and were efficiently isolated. The initial impact, which Hannibal had hoped would be decisive, failed. The first Carthaginian line clashed with the legions, and the hand-to-hand combat stretched across the entire front. The mercenaries fought fiercely, but seeing no support from the rear, they panicked. Hannibal, fearing the collapse of his second line, ordered the mercenaries to retreat, but they were repelled violently by the Carthaginians themselves. The result was a heap of bodies, screams, and disarray. Scipio held his troops firm, waiting for the right moment to break through. When the Carthaginian veterans, Hannibal's third line, and finally entered the field, the battle regained balance. The combat between the legions and the Italian veterans was brutal, prolonged, and bloody. But the decisive factor was about to reveal itself. The Numidian cavalry, which had vanished from the wings at the battle's start, now reappeared behind the Carthaginian army, attacking from the rear. It was a Beek's reverse repetition of Cannae. The encirclement was complete. Hannibal's soldiers, trapped between the legions and the enemy cavalry, were slaughtered. The victory was total. Carthage was defeated. Hannibal, surviving the disaster, returned to the city and advised the Senate to accept Rome's terms. He knew that resisting would mean absolute destruction. Scipio, in a gesture of magnanimity, imposed a harsh treaty. Carthage would lose all possessions outside Africa, surrender its war fleet, pay a heavy indemnity, and promise never to declare war without Rome's consent. Though not physically destroyed, Carthage was now politically and militarily neutralized. Zama sealed the fate of the Mediterranean. Rome, victorious, consolidated itself as the hegemonic power of the ancient world. Scipio, honored as Africanus, entered history as the only man to defeat Hannibal in open battle. Hannibal, in turn, became the most respected defeated general in history, the tragic symbol of an empire that dared, fought, nearly won, but was overcome by a foe more patient, more pragmatic, and above all, more resilient. The Second Punic War came to an end, but its scar would remain open. Rome would never trust Carthage again, and Carthage, stripped of its navy, its resources, and its honor, would live under the humiliation of Roman yoke until the day Rome decided, without warning, that defeating was not enough. It was necessary to annihilate. With the end of the Battle of Zama in 202 before Christ, Rome not only sealed its military supremacy, but also inaugurated a new world order in the Mediterranean. The peace treaty signed shortly after, under the unyielding imposition of Scipio Africanus, was not a mere armistice. It was an instrument of containment, amputation, and systematic humiliation. Carthage, though still standing, ceased to be a power. Its territorial influence, naval capacity, and political autonomy were reduced to a minimum in a calculated process designed to slowly drain any possibility of resurgence. And as Carthage diminished, Rome expanded, not only in territorial extension but also as an idea, as an institution, as an empire in formation. The peace after Zama was not the end of war. It was the beginning of imperial Rome. The treaty imposed harsh sanctions on Carthage. The city lost in all its colonies outside Africa, including the rich and strategic Iberian Peninsula, whose silver mines had financed the Carthaginian war effort. These territories were immediately turned into Roman provinces, Hispania Citeria and Hispania Ulteria, administered by proconsuls appointed by the Senate. Thus, Rome not only inherited the territorial legacy of the Barcids, but also secured control over a mineral wealth that would fund its coffers for centuries. Moreover, Carthage was required to pay 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, a sum that would drain its economy for generations. It was a financial punishment designed to keep the city permanently indebted, dependent, and politically submissive. The Carthaginian navy, once the largest in the known world, was dismantled. Only 10 ships were left for coastal defense. All the others, hundreds of vessels, were handed over to Rome and publicly burned in Carthage's harbor. This scene, described by Polybius and other chroniclers, became the symbol of the new hierarchy. The black smoke rising from the burning hulls was the funeral of Carthage's maritime past. The city was also forbidden from waging war, even in self-defense, without prior authorization from Rome. In practical terms, Carthage became a vassal state, a mutilated power, a shadow of what it once had been. Internally, the treaty reignited tensions. The Carthaginian Senate, divided between the aristocratic faction and the former supporters of the Barcids, now found itself under constant Roman surveillance. Hannibal, who had survived the defeat at Zama, briefly held the office of suffect, a kind of consul, and tried to implement administrative, fiscal, and judicial reforms that could restore dignity and functionality to the city. He curtailed the power of the oligarchy, fought corruption, and attempted to renegotiate part of the debts. But his presence was an inconvenience to Rome. Scipio, though he admired his rival, knew Hannibal's popularity was dangerous. Under diplomatic pressure, Hannibal was forced into exile. He traveled to Tyre, then to Syria, and finally to Bithynia, where he spent his final years pursued by Roman emissaries, until he chose to take his own life with poison, preferring death to capture. Even in death, Rome feared him. While Carthage withered in silence, Rome flourished on an unprecedented scale. The years following the victory at Zama marked an explosion of power. New trade routes were opened, colonies were founded, and a senatorial elite enriched by war came to dominate all spheres of politics. The conquest of Hispania, with its precious metals, enabled the rise of an economy based on mining and systematic plunder. The legions became permanent. Provincial administration took shape. The Senate transformed not just into a political council, but into an imperial directorate. And expansionist mentality, once defensive, now turned deliberately offensive. Furthermore, the victory over Hannibal fueled a collective ethos that drove the Republic to go beyond its former limits. The idea that Rome was invincible spread as dogma. The young aristocrats who had grown up in the shadow of the Punic Wars now saw conquest as the only legitimate path to prestige. Thus was born a new generation of ambitious generals, many of whom were more loyal to their own glory than to the Senate, who would lead Rome into even greater campaigns against Macedonia, Greece, Gaul, and eventually the East. Carthage, for its part, survived with difficulty. Without a navy, without armies, and burdened by heavy tributes, it turned to agriculture and regional commerce. Paradoxically, its economy slowly began to recover. Carthaginian entrepreneurs expanded plantations, exported grain and textiles, and restored part of the city's lost dynamism. But Rome viewed this revival with suspicion. Every ship, every trade deal, every hint of recovery was seen as a risk, a threat to the hegemony won through blood and time. Peace in this context was merely a pause for inspection. Rome did not forgive, and never forgot. Meanwhile, in Roman imagination, Carthage became the archetypal enemy. In theatres, in forums, in senatorial speeches, the Carthaginian name became synonymous with treachery, obstinacy, and arrogance. It was necessary, some said, to ensure that Carthage could never rise again. Among those men was Marcus Porcius Cato, the elder, who ended all his speeches, regardless of the subject, with the same phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. That mantra grew more frequent year by year. The generation that had fought at Zama was aging. The veterans were dying, but the shadow of Carthage continued to disturb. Rome had won, but the mere fact that Carthage still existed, still breathed, still traded, was intolerable. The Second Punic War had ended, but the wound had never healed. It was only a matter of time and provocation before the Republic decided that the punishment inflicted was still insufficient. In 149 before Christ, more than half a century after the end of the Second Punic War, Rome did the unthinkable. It declared war on a Carthage that no longer posed a military threat, no longer had a navy, no longer had allies, and controlled no territories beyond its immediate region. It was not a war of defense, but a war of decision, the decision to erase an entire civilization from the face of the earth. The Third Punic War, unlike the previous ones, was not fought over territorial hegemony or strategic rivalry. It was fought over ideology, accumulated resentment, and above all, political calculation. Rome no longer wanted to contain Carthage. It wanted to obliterate it, to ensure it would never exist again, and it succeeded. During the decades that followed the peace treaty of Zama, Carthage had cautiously re-emerged as an agricultural and commercial hub. Deprived of its military power, it turned toward labor and production. With vast plantations and a renewed internal market, the city began to prosper. This recovery, however, disturbed Rome, especially the more belligerent wing of the Senate, led by Cato the Elder, who visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission, and upon seeing its markets thriving and its walls rebuilt, returned to Rome convinced that the city must be destroyed. His famous refrain, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, became the conclusion to all his speeches, a sentiment that initially seemed extreme, but eventually took root as doctrine. The pretext for the new war came with the conflict between Carthage and Massinissa, king of the Numidians and an ally of Rome. Massinissa, encouraged by Roman ambiguity, began invading Carthaginian lands under various pretexts. Carthage, forbidden by treaty from making war without Rome's consent, protested. Rome ignored the pleas. In desperation, the city dispatched armies to defend itself, and this act was used by the Senate as justification to declare war. It was the perfect trap. Provoke a reaction, then condemn it. Upon receiving the declaration of war, Carthage responded with submission. It voluntarily surrendered weapons, ships, and hostages. It disarmed publicly. But Rome did not want submission. It wanted annihilation. The Roman consuls then demanded the unthinkable, that the entire population of Carthage abandon the city and destroy it with their own hands, relocating, by Roman order, dozens of kilometers inland. It was at that moment that Carthage understood that nothing could save its existence, and it chose to fight. The city, now without an army, without a navy, without allies, became a desperate fortress. Weapons were mass-produced within the walls, farming tools became spears, harbor chains became shields, women cut their own hair to make bowstrings. Every citizen, men, women, and elders, was mobilized. The walls were reinforced. Thus began the final siege. The siege of Carthage lasted around 3 years, from 149 to 146 before Christ. The Romans, led by various generals, encountered fierce resistance. The city, protected by 3 lines of walls and situated between lagoons and natural fortifications, fought back with the fury of the condemned. Every street became a trench, every house a bastion. The Romans attempted multiple naval blockades, built walls around the besieged city, and faced violent sorties from the defenders, but Carthage did not yield, not to hunger, not to fear. It was only in 146 before Christ, under the command of Castor Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, that the city finally fell. The final assault, brutal and methodical, lasted 6 days and 6 nights. Streets were taken one by one. The defenders retreated to the rooftops, fought house to house, set entire districts ablaze to slow the Roman advance. Temples were stormed, plazas flooded with blood. It is estimated that over 200,000 people perished in the siege, and another 50,000 hearts were enslaved. When the last Carthaginian stronghold fell, the Temple of Eshmun, perched atop the hill, the city had ceased to exist even before being consumed by fire. Scipio Aemilianus, upon contemplating the smouldering ruins of Carthage, wept. Reports claim that amid the ashes he recited verses from Homer about the destruction of Troy, foretelling that Rome too would one day meet its end. But in that moment, to the eyes of the world, the victory was absolute. Carthage was literally erased from the map. Its lands were declared cursed, and, though it is controversial, tradition says salt was scattered over the soil to prevent any rebirth. The city was transformed into a Roman province under the name Africa, and its ruins became a monument of warning. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. The Third Punic War was not merely the end of a civilization. It was the birth of an imperial mindset that would shape the centuries to come. Rome had learned that it was not enough to win. It had to ensure that no resistance could ever rise again. Power, to be absolute, had to be irreversible. The fate of Carthage sealed the path Rome would follow from then on. Conquest without remorse, domination without limits, extermination as method. And thus, in the year 146 before Christ, the trilogy of the Punic Wars came to an end. Carthage, which for centuries had ruled the seas, had challenged the Republic on the battlefield, had taught Rome to fear, was reduced to dust. Yet its name, paradoxically, never disappeared. For in every Roman street, in every Senate speech, in every legion's march, there echoed even after the destruction the whisper of a worthy adversary, and the world, remembering victorious Rome, would forever remember Carthage, defeated but immortal.